Today, I think that the characteristic of all these speakers, what's common about the speakers, you have to fill in a question, what's common about all these people, is that they have an unusual level of, I'd say, physical courage and intellectual courage. Our first speaker, and I'm going to introduce each person as they appear so that everybody can think about them as, you know, as they're talking. Our first speaker is Zora Ahmed, and she's a Pakistani woman who is a law student at Fordham University. She will be working this summer with the ACLU on legal cases related to drone warfare. And so, Zora, would you come forward and please let's give it a applause.
Hi, thank you for having me, Nick. This is a wonderful effort. I'm really honored to be part of it. I'll be speaking about the drone strikes in Pakistan and how the drone program fits into the very fraught relationship between the US and Pakistan, and some of those serious legal questions that are raised by the program. So just to backtrack a little bit, how did we end up bombing Pakistan? So the US first started conducting covert strikes in Pakistan starting in 2004, but we really started to hear about them in 2008 and 2009 when the number of strikes dramatically increased under Obama. And Pakistan has always been a country of concern for the US after 9/11, but I think you can point to the 2008 presidential election campaign in one debate, for example, the only thing that McCain and Obama agreed upon was that it was Iran and Pakistan which posed the two greatest threats to US national security. And it's in this context that we see the word, the Afghan war emerge. And it's a recognition that by the US, by Washington, that success in Afghanistan was tied to negotiating a particular relationship with Pakistan, and therefore justified military action inside of Pakistan. Most of what we know about the war in Pakistan is secondhand, and for a variety of reasons. First of all the strikes have been taking place in the federally administered tribal areas, which is in the northwest of Pakistan. Historically, has been very isolated, has been subject to its own criminal law, own courts, and has been sort of under its different control since Pakistan was formed. And to this day, it's very hard to gain access to the places that are being bombed, and the only way that advocates have been able to access victims is when victims and survivors is that they have come via bus into Islamabad. It's been very difficult for journalists to actually gain access to this part of the country. On the US side, it's been impossible to gain any sort of information about why the US thinks it's okay to be bombing Pakistan, what the justifications are, what intelligence it's relying upon. As Nick mentioned, the ACLU and some other organizations have been suing the US government because it hasn't complied with its obligation under the Freedom of Information Act, which requires the government to disclose information when someone makes a request. And the US government essentially says that it cannot disclose the justifications for this war or who we're targeting because it would compromise national security interests. That's all fine and good, but at the same time you have every day in the New York Times you read about a drone strike. And Eric Holder goes on record and talks about, in very broad and general terms, on what basis the US targets people. So this is, the secrecy is used very selectively. And essentially the US is keeping the drone program secret because it can. And that basically precludes any of us from really knowing what's going on. And the little information that we do have suggests that the civilian casualties are much higher than what the mainstream media would have us would tell us. For example, on October 31st of 2011, Foreign Policy, which runs its own separate tally of drone casualties, states that 4 to 6 militants died in a particular strike in North Waziristan. But on the ground, Clive Stafford Smith, who is a lawyer with Reprieve, was there, and he found out that actually two of the people killed were 16-year-old boys who were just searching for information and trying to collect evidence from a prior drone strike. So clearly the information on the ground, what is reported to us, are really incongruent. But from the little anecdotal evidence that we have, we know that the casualty number, which is I guess 800 people, really underestimates the number of civilians that have been affected. So even if we take the US's assertion that it's targeting militants at face value, there are some really important inconsistencies in its legal justification. So according to the authorization of the use of military force, which gave us the war in Iraq, gave us the war in Afghanistan, and is ostensibly supporting strikes in Yemen, Pakistan, and Somalia, the US is supposed to be at war with Al-Qaeda and associated forces. And those groups in Pakistan that are targeted, that are supposed to be associated forces, are the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, Al-Qaeda, and the Haqqani network. But if we take one of these groups, like the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, there's no suggestion that this group is in any way linked to Al-Qaeda. If anything, this group may have some broad ideological alignment with Al-Qaeda, but there's no actual logistical or military involvement. And basically the US is using mere ideological alignment as the basis for targeting people. So because groups support the insurgency in Afghanistan, that becomes basis for targeting. And this targeting is based on just speculation, geographic proximity, and what we have is a preventative war. So the US is killing people because it merely suspects that these people might become potential terrorists and potential threats to the US. And essentially we all know that preventative war doesn't exist, and essentially just perpetuates instability and creates the conditions for a next stage of insurgency. And so the word militant, which is used so casually to permit all sorts of killing, is really the only way to understand this term, is that it's a word that allows us to, it's a word that's used basically to designate all those people that we can kill without feeling bad about it or without ever being held accountable for. And that's the only way that this word militant, I think, is being used in this war. And the result is that we have 800 people who have died, civilians, after 250 strikes. And every day that increases. So the kind of war that emerges from this is a war that is hugely asymmetric, completely detached, and of course, like all wars, dehumanizing. The technology is very sophisticated. I bet, whenever I've been with Nick on the street with this model drone, you get this sort of fascination from, young boys, oh, what is this toy? It's so cool. I think the sophistication that technology makes us believe that this is a precise and surgical war with very little cost and very little blowback. Of course, the US actually never suffers the blowback. The blowback is always in Pakistan against Pakistani civilians. And the geographic detachment that is permitted by the drone strikes actually allows the government to remain unaccountable and to kill indiscriminately. These drones hover in Pakistan, Waziristan, and in other parts of the federally administered tribal areas for almost whole days and emit these horrible sonar sounds the entire time before they actually launch the missile. And as a result of it, people on the ground have resorted to taking anti-anxiety pills and taking sleeping pills to be able to cope with it. And at the same time, as Nick mentioned, we're seeing increase in PTSD in the pilots that are operating these robots in Nevada and elsewhere. Another, I think, important thing to look at and aspect of the drone program is how the drone program fits in a very, very tense relationship between the US and Pakistan. So just earlier this week, the Pakistani parliament issued a set of demands, one of which was to call for an end to drone strikes and to call for an end of using Pakistani airspace to wage war in Afghanistan. We'll have yet to see to what extent this demand has any teeth, but I think that what it signals is there's growing opposition within Pakistan against the drone strikes. And there's been no accountability, just like I said, there's no accountability in the US for the drone program. There's been very little accountability in Pakistan for the victims who have suffered from the drone strikes. So basically what the Pakistani government has done is that it insists that it hasn't actually given permission to the US to use its airspace. it keeps on, it shifts the blame. It says, no, 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 this is Uncle Sam who's doing it. We really have no control. Of course, the Pakistani government has allowed the drones to take off and take on, to take the land and take off in Pakistan. They can't operate without Pakistani approval, but the Pakistani government basically passes the buck. And you have essentially a game, you know, each country is just shifting the blame against each other, and that absolves both countries of responsibility. At the same time, encouraged by the US, what you have in Pakistan is a very low intensity war that is being waged in other parts of the tribal areas in Pakistan. The Pakistani military has waged essentially its own war of terror. It has tried to eradicate terrorists through, you know, targeted offenses and through very, very brutal law enforcement policies. And what you see is a replication of the national security state in Pakistan. You have just forced disappearances, people held incommunicado, and we're starting to see a little bit of accountability. Some of the people that were made disappeared by the Pakistani military were brought forward last month to the Supreme Court, but many of the people who were initially on that list who disappeared have actually died. At the same time, the drone program has come to a huge cost. You know, so while the drone program has allowed the Pakistani government to conduct its own excesses, to brutalize its own population, it's also come at a huge cost. And the result is that you're seeing that people in Islamabad are starting to change their own policy and their own stance vis-a-vis the war, and to what extent they're going to comply with the US's demands. Finally, there are some interesting legal issues that come up when we're talking about the drone strikes. What we're seeing the U.S. doing is that it's conflating two different paradigms to explain the war. It's claiming self-defense, and it's claiming that it's engaged in a hot war. And basically, the government is conducting lawfare. It's using the law selectively to basically shut out criticism and to say that, yes, we're engaging with the law, but we're engaging the law on our own terms, and we are making the law as we go along. And that's extremely dangerous, and you hear this again and again from different pundits on the right saying that, oh, you know, the laws just really don't reflect our current day reality because, you know, they don't take into consideration the fact that we are engaged in a global warfare and that we're dealing with new threats, and this is an asymmetric threat. But what's really happening is that the U.S. is actually engaging in an asymmetric war, using drones, which are epitomizing the asymmetry of the situation. Essentially, it is launching a war, it is launching bombs on populations which have absolutely no means of retaliating because these machines fly at least a mile up into the sky. I think that's all I will say about that for the time being, and I will be happy to answer any questions during the Q&A.
Thank you, Zora. Our next speaker is Medea Benjamin. She's the co-founder of Code Pink. Medea is also co-founder of Global Exchange, that not only is an organization had to do with fair trade, but has assisted people to go to a variety of countries to understand what's going on. She's been arrested in Pakistan, interestingly enough, in 2007, protesting the house arrest of a lawyer there. And this year, she was arrested in Bahrain because she had the idea, I guess, that there was freedom of assembly or free speech there or something like that, and suddenly found out that the government wasn't interested in that. They're allies of the United States, but they aren't interested in free speech. Medea has just written a book called Drone Warfare, Killing by Remote Control. And I think that it's a huge contribution to the whole awakening of the public about drone warfare, and something that is much needed. But I think we have to give Medea a lot of applause just for raising hell about stuff that really needs it.
Well, thank you, and thanks to Nick for making guess we got one in DC, and it's in our office, and you kind of look up and it reminds you of just how evil the use of this machine is. Because let's remember, technology can be used for good, and there's plenty of ways that drones can be used for good, and we can have a nice discussion about that afterwards. But what is driving this technology is not to take food to victims of earthquakes in Haiti, or to help people trying to figure out what the government of Syria is doing to peaceful protesters. It's really being driven by the military, by the CIA, and by countries around the world that want to catch up with the technology and have it available to do their own killing and their own spying on other people around the world as well as their own citizens. So I think that it's an amazing paradox right now, because we have been since 9/11 in 10 years of war right now, right? The American people are tired of war. You see that in the statistics. They show that more people than ever before are sick and tired of war in Afghanistan and want the troops to get out, and think, why are we waiting till 2015 to make that happen? Why don't they come home now? And even the majority of Republicans say they want us to get out of Afghanistan. So keep that thought in your mind, and then take this other thought, which is the majority of people think it is just fine to use drones against suspected militants, and that's suspected militants, right? And that majority of people includes the majority of Democrats. So here you have people sick and tired of war, and yet you have people saying, well, you know, those drones, they're a good alternative to war. As if they were some alternative to war. And that's why I think it's so important for us to concentrate on this particular weapon and how it's being used, because it's being used to trick the American people to think we are getting out of these wars, and instead allows us to continue to be at war and expand those wars. Because as Zor showed, I mean, we're not at war, one says, with Pakistan, right? I mean, we're supposedly allies with the Pakistani government, yet we don't give a damn what the Pakistani government says. They can say till they're blue in the face, we don't want you to use these drones, and we say, too bad, we're going to use them. And the U.S. is doing that everywhere. So we're using them now in Yemen. There have been more drone strikes in Yemen in the past 2 months than even in Pakistan, using them in Somalia, and who knows where else we are using drones. We have reports right now that there was a drone attack in the Philippines last month. But these are secret programs. They're not even run by our military. Most of them are run by the CIA, as well as with private contractors that are involved in this. So this is very scary, the way the U.S. is really pulling the wool over the eyes of the American people under constitutional lawyer Barack Obama, and how we are causing this huge proliferation in spying and killing with this new technology. It's not just the United States that has drones. What's the number 2 producer and user of drones? Israel. And that's important to understand the relationship. In fact, the Predator and Reaper drones that we are using in Pakistan and elsewhere were developed by an Israeli engineer working for the Israeli military, and came over to the United States to perfect the drone and sell it to the U.S. military and then the CIA. The Israelis are not only producing drones, they are selling them all over the place, and they don't have the same restrictions that drone producers in the U.S. have about where they can sell them. And what's the number 3 producer of drones? You'll have to buy this book. It's called Drone Warfare, because we have quite a long chapter about who's producing the drones and who is consuming these drones and who are the victims of the drones. The number 3 producer is China. And China is going all out with these drones right now. And China has no restrictions on where they can sell these drones. So there's over 50 countries right now that have drones. Now they say they're using them for spying. Do you believe that they can't just strap on some missiles and use them for killing as well? It's a very simple technology to turn a spy drone into a killer drone. And it's a very it's a sophisticated technology on the one hand, but it's not sophisticated compared to a nuclear bomb. And these drones are crashing all over the place. So our supposed enemies are getting lots of ability to copy our drones because they're falling down in their skies. We saw what happened in the case of Iran when they say they took down one of the drones and the US was like, oops, you know. But that's happening all over the place because one of the things they don't talk about is how many of these drones crash. In fact, one of the places where we are stationing the drones is in the islands in the Seychelles. And they just said, whoa, put a stop to that program, let's see why are all these drones crashing. We got a letter from some friends in Australia yesterday, and they said, all of a sudden, you know, we have a very strong peace movement in Australia. We turn around and all of a sudden we find not only our U.S. military coming to Australia, but they're taking these islands of ours called the Cocos Islands, and they're turning it into a base for drones. How did that happen? So this is just spreading in a very dangerous fashion. I like to talk about the golden rule when it comes to international relations, and always say, what if? So when we hear about what the U.S. is doing, and people try to justify it, we say, what if somebody else was doing this? So Zora talked about the destruction of international law when it comes to the use of drones. And the U.S. has basically said, we can kill anybody anywhere that we think is an imminent threat to us, and we're going to define what that imminent threat is all about, and this is part of our self-defense. So, I don't know if you've ever heard of somebody named Luis Posada Carriles. He's a terrorist. He's a known terrorist, and he's been living in Miami. And you know, part of the justification for using drones in other people's countries is they won't comply with the law and bring these people to justice. So we have been letting a known terrorist who is known to have downed a Cuban plane back in '76, has never been brought to justice, let him live the good life in Miami. Why shouldn't the Cubans get a drone and just drop it on his condo in Miami? What about the Chinese who think they are at war with the Uyghurs, and there are Uyghurs living here in the United States? What if they decide, okay, we're just going to come to a flat here in Brooklyn and drop one of these drones on them? Would we allow it to happen? And it's come out recently that, of course, we've been using spy planes in Iran all this time. I mean, what if the Iranians were using drones to spy on us here in the United States? Would we allow it to happen? That's American exceptionalism, it's might makes right, it's racism, and this is part of the empire that thinks it can do whatever it damn well wants, and translates to us that they are doing it in the name of our security, and all the while they are making us less and less secure, because every time they use a drone to kill anybody that they even call a militant, or they say, oops, it was a civilian in the wrong place at the wrong time, they are creating more enemies towards the United States, and they're keeping the cycle of violence going, and the only ones who are really benefiting from this cycle of violence is the producers of these weapons, the 1%, the corporations that are now addicted to war. And of course, as part of their addiction, they are buying off our Congress. And I think it's so great that Nick and the groups that are going out there are focusing on the members of the Congress that are part of something, just to even say it sounds so disgusting to me. I mean, they are part of the drone caucus. Why should we have a drone caucus in Congress? I mean, I could see a caucus to say, we need more preschool for the kids that don't get a chance to go to preschool. We need a caucus that's going to look out for how we're going to make sure that we don't have clinics all over this country that are closing down. We need a caucus for all kinds of things that we, the people, need. And since we're elected by we, the people, those are the caucuses that we should have. Instead, they have a caucus to say, how are we going to spread the proliferation of drones abroad and at home? And I know one of our other speakers is going to talk about it at home, but let's remember these two things are linked. And so these members of the drone caucus, I mean, you can just do a straight correlation between how much money they are getting from drone producers and how vociferous they are in our Congress to say yes to the drones. And not only are they in the drone caucus, they bring the drones to the nation's capital. They bring the drones to the nation's capital. They have a fair every year where they put these monstrosities on display in the lobbies, in the galleries of the U.S. Capitol. And everybody can come by and marvel at this wonderful technology. Well, I, along with some friends, didn't feel like we should marvel at that technology, and so when they had the drone display the last time, we went in there and we did a die-in. We started screaming and moaning on the ground and saying, "Help, help!" And we had signs saying Afghanistan, Pakistan, Somalia, Yemen. And we were saying, "Please, please, don't kill us, don't kill us." And of course, the police came in to kick us out so that the drone show could go on unencumbered by any moaning from a symbolic die-in of people who are the victims of these drones. So I wanted to end with just a couple of little quotes from the book, and I hope you'll buy the book. It just came out like 2 days ago, and I'm very excited that we had it in time for this gathering, and look forward to going around the country and trying to educate more people about the drones. One is a quote from a Pakistani photographer that we tried to get in the country for the drone summit at the end of April. We were told we would never get him in. We were trying to get in the lawyer who is the lawyer for the drone victims. And so far the U.S. government is refusing to give him a visa. The photographer, name is Noor Behram, just to give you a sense of what he finds as he risks his life going around in North Waziristan trying to take photographs of the drone strikes. He says, "There are just pieces of flesh lying around after a strike. You can't find bodies. So the locals pick up the flesh and they curse America. They say America is killing us inside our own country, inside our own homes, and only because we are Muslims." That is the way many people in Pakistan and around the world feel. And of course, it doesn't create a lot of sympathy towards the United States. On the other hand, if you happen to pick up the Wall Street Journal, you might find an editorial that said, "Never before in the history of warfare with the use of drones have we been able to distinguish as well between combatants and civilians." And my final quote I want to do is perhaps my favorite response to Eric Holder. The U.S. has not admitted that we even have a drone program that's run by the CIA because it's a secret program. And so Eric Holder finally was forced to say something about it, but this was only in March of 2012 when he was speaking to a bunch of law students at Northwestern University and tried to justify this use of drones, and justify it not only for killing other people's citizens, but for killing our own citizens. And he said, "Well, the Constitution does not guarantee its citizens the right to judicial process, but only to due process." So Stephen Colbert thought that was great, and he says, yes, the founders weren't picky. Trial by jury, trial by fire, rock, paper, scissors, who cares? Due process, it just means it's a process that you do. And the current process is that the president meets with his advisors, they decide who to kill, and then they kill them. If we're going to win our never-ending war against terror, there are bound to be casualties, Colbert sighed, and one of them just happens to be the U.S. Constitution. Thank you.
I want to thank Glenn Ford very much for coming today. Glenn is the executive director and principal author for the Black Agenda Report. And in this array of commentary about the Obama administration, about what's happening around the world, Glenn is particularly clear in his understanding that regardless of the race of the president, there are certain standards that we have to look for and demand. And he's a very clear and a voice of integrity. And we want to thank you for coming up here.
Thank you, and I can only keep myself clear by having a script, so bear with me, okay? Power to the people.
All power to the people.
Power to the people of the world. The because the people of the world are going to need it. And they're going to need it because this government, this administration, the man that most of you voted for in the last election, has declared war in a real sense on the people of the world collectively, including the inhabitants of the United States. He is methodically waging war against peace and against every instrument that humankind has devised over the centuries in an attempt to keep the peace. Now, why am I sounding so apocalyptic? I'm doing that because I really feel that this is the case, because Obama has declared war against international law. He's declared war against the very concept of national sovereignty as we have come to know it over the centuries. He's served notice that no nation on the planet is safe and that every person on the planet Earth is fair game for his killing machines. This president has crossed an historical Rubicon. He is trying now to pull the world with him into this terrifying darkness, and nobody should be surprised that he has done this, because Obama told you that he was going to do it. This was no secret. If you didn't hear it, it's because you didn't want to hear it. He announced back on the campaign trail that he was going to unleash the drones. In fact, he promised you that he was going to unleash the drones in amazing numbers. And that was a promise that Obama has kept. He instructed all of his surrogates during that campaign to explain to you in detail on talk shows and in constant sessions with reporters that his war in Afghanistan and in Pakistan would be a smart war, a drone war, not a gun war like George Bush's war. And many of you bought into that. You thought of that as somehow a lesser evil. He told you that drone warfare would be cheaper and that it would be more efficient and that it would save lives, that it would save American lives, it would save Pakistani lives, and it would save Afghani lives. And in that euphoria of that phony peace campaign, many people swallowed that poison pill of drone warfare. And doing that, they were also swallowing the collapse of the international order that inevitably goes with unleashing the drones. Barack Obama took his election day victory as a mandate to start waging these famously smart wars, these drone wars. He has now elevated to a strategic principle the notion that the United States is uniquely entitled to use whatever technical means is at its disposal to target and kill whoever it chooses, any place that it chooses, any time that it chooses, and that it will be accountable only to itself. That is a total repudiation of international law. That is not just breaking international law, that is repudiating it. Understand, we're not talking about some episodic breach of international law by the United States, some episodic violation. The United States breaks international law all the time. It always has, and its partners do too. It does that as a matter of convenience. But this is something very different, and I can't emphasize that enough. This repudiation of international law, as we have come to understand international law, and it's really not that difficult, is a repudiation of the fundamental universal principles of the sovereignty of nations, the way the world has been set up over hundreds and hundreds of years. Most importantly, even more important than that, this declaration, and it's a declaration really of lawlessness, is now central to the U.S. military's strategy and its philosophy of war and peace. It is at the core of U.S. plans to dominate the world militarily, and now it is the guiding force in American relations with the rest of the world. You can't separate relations during times of war or when in a state of belligerence from relations with nations in times of peace, because war is always a threat to the relations that you have at times of peace. We make the rules, is what Obama has told the rest of the world. And he says that the old rules, meaning international law, do not apply. He says that we will take out individuals and countries as we see fit, not just covertly, like in the good old days, but in the clear light of day. And we will do that as a matter of policy. Not 007, not James Bond, but as a matter of policy. We will assemble, this is part of the new strategy, we will assemble coalitions based on our strategic ambitions. And we will tell other countries that they can either join those ad hoc coalitions or they can risk winding up being on the other end of our extraordinary technical firepower and, of course, our drones. That is the current state of international law as recognized or imposed by the United States. U.S. planning for future relations among nations is now based on tools of war. And by that I mean the drones and also the special operations forces whose full deployment, whose full exploitation by the United States requires that we have a world without international law. It is a necessity to have that kind of framework in order for the United States to use the weapons that it has spent all these billions of dollars for. This requires the eradication of due process of law as an organizing principle of relations between peoples and among peoples. I'm going to repeat this. U.S. strategy requires that due process of law be thrown into the waste bin of history. Drone warfare kills suspects without trial, it kills them without charge, and without possibility of surrender. It is proper to call that kind of activity terror. But what is even more profoundly terrifying about it is that it utterly destroys the concept of due process. And without due process, there is no rule of law. Thus, in the United States crusade to make the entire world into a kind of free fire zone, it is succeeding in turning the world into a no-law zone as well. A world without due process and without law. And that logic must include the United States. And if you thought it wouldn't, you were quite naive. So those of you who voted for Obama and his utterly lawless but very, very smart drone warfare program should understand that this is what paved the way for the abolition of due process right here at home. One follows inexorably after the other. They are inseparable. And it's not as if Obama didn't give us a heads up on that too. Shortly after assuming office, he was telling reporters, well, of course, there must be some form of preventive detention. He said it quite frequently, and what he meant was, of course, our foreign policy to abolish the rule of law, the rule of law and due process is a global foreign policy, and so it applies to the United States just like everywhere else. So Obama gave us fair warning that he would soon be shaping a preventive detention bill, and he was, once again, true to his word. Sometimes he is. Most people who call themselves progressive simply refused to hear him when he told us what was coming down the hopper. When the deed was done And when that bill was signed on New Year's Eve, we still heard some people quibbling about whether this brave new world would expose the citizenry to imprisonment without trial and without charge under military or under civilian auspices. And personally, I really don't see the difference. I do not understand that argument. If due process is a dead letter, then there is no rule of law, period. I would think, in fact, that if you put the Star Chamber under military control, that at least would give it an aura of being temporary, something that is only fit for this particular emergency or occasion or whatever excuse they wanted to concoct. Whereas if it's under civilian control, it's here forever, and forever and a day. It never will go away. But I'm going to let my daughter and other lawyers argue and quibble about that. I think the ultimate truth is either due process is an inherent human right or it isn't. And since New Year's Eve in the United States, it isn't. We've already lost our constitutional protections. They flew away on a drone, and Obama was on the joystick. And the U.S. is now a law-free zone by statute. And any president, he or she, can activate these draconian powers at their convenience. Out there in the rest of the world, the U.S. imperial offensive is in full swing. After all, that's the whole purpose for this preventive detention law at home. It's the whole purpose for making the entire planet, including the United States, a no-law zone. The United States has superimposed its own rules of conduct in place of international law. Those rules are embodied under the, I think it's a slogan rather than a doctrine, of humanitarian military intervention. And that means whatever President Obama says it means. Humanitarian intervention in practice strips nations of sovereignty just as quickly as a drone erases the life of its victims. And you don't even have to be a belligerent. You don't have to get in the way of the United States with guns in hand to become a victim of humanitarian military intervention. All you have to do is ask Haiti. Haiti was stripped naked to the world without an ounce of sovereignty in practical effect. And it was one of the first victims of humanitarian intervention. That was under George Bush. But this man, Obama, has got it down to a diabolical science. If you support, or if you are ambivalent about U.S. intervention in Syria or in Iran, then you have bought into Obama's world without laws. It is a world of raw force. It is a world of barbarianism. So if you've ever wondered, and I have, of course, over the decades, if you've ever wondered how imperialism in its late stages is going to go out, it is in convulsions of lawlessness that shape the foundations of civilization as we have come to know it. And you, right now, you are a witness to that. Power to the people.